Hello everyone, today on my bench I have the legendary MXR Phase 90 and we are going to be doing the script mod. Now, the script mod is a fairly common mod done to these pedals. It only changes two components out and it's fairly simple, so let's get started. It only requires a couple of tools such as a screwdriver, or if you're impatient, you could use a power drill as long as you're careful not to strip the screws, a set of wire clippers, some wire strippers are also going to come in handy. I'll be using 22 gauge wire myself. If you don't already have these, get some rocket sockets. They are awesome. They make disassembling the pedal much easier. You're also going to need a double pull, double throw switch in the on-on configuration. Obviously a soldering iron and some solder is going to make this mod much easier for you, as well as a solder sucker if you don't already have one. Other than that, I can't think of much else that you will need, so let's get right into this thing. Now, if you flip the pedal over, you'll see there are 4 screws, and that's going to be our first step in getting this thing started, is removing all 4 of them and putting them somewhere where you will not lose them. I actually personally like to use the back plates of the pedal that I am modding as a nice little tray to put all the little hardware pieces, screws, whatever they may be. So before you take any of the other hardware off, you are going to want to remove this knob. It does just come off with a little bit of pressure, and there's also a small internal washer that comes right off as well. And then you have 4 nuts you're going to want to remove if you include the foot switch, and that's where these little socket rockets come in handy. It's going to be size 11 for the input and the output jack, and I believe the potentiometer as well. And then it looks like a 14 is going to do us for the foot switch right now. And again, that comes right off. And then you can pop the board right out of the enclosure, and it should come out all neat and put together as such. Now, if you take a look at this board, you can see that all of the components on it are through hole. That means that the parts go through the back and you can see all the solder joints on the opposite side. And the way we are going to figure out what components to change out is from How to Modify Guitar Pedals by Brian Wampler. This is a great book if you haven't used it before. There's sections on tons of pedals that are super easy to mod, but we are going to do the one on page 283, which will show us how to do the script mod, and it will even circle the parts on the board and show you which ones need to be replaced. It is R28 and C11. Those are the 2 components we are going to be playing with in order to give this pedal a more retro phasing feel like in the script Phase 90. Luckily, Brian has them circled in the book, and they are very easy to locate here and here. The book tells you to remove them, but we are actually just going to put them on a switch. So the first thing we're going to do is separate one of the legs from the capacitor just by clipping it with our wire cutters and kind of getting one side of it off of the board. The capacitor is fairly easy to remove because it's at the edge of the board, but with the resistor being so close to the output jack, you kind of got to wedge your wire cutters in there to get it. Now, if you wanted to make this mod a lot easier, you could literally just completely remove these 2 components by cutting both legs, snap it back in the enclosure, and you would just have a script Phase 90, but that's not what we want to do. Now, what we are actually going to do is we're going to take some wire and connect it to the ends of the components that we had just cut. So take a short length of wire, strip both of the ends, and prepare to connect it between the board and the switch. So flip the board over to find the hole containing the little bit of solder and the tiny bit of leg from the component you cut, and use a soldering iron to try to empty that as best as you can. If you have a solder sucker, it'll probably be a little bit easier for you to use that to get the remaining piece out, but do whatever works best for you. Sometimes turning the board over and getting at it from both sides can help you get whatever remaining little bits of solder and component leg are still within the board. Be patient, don't scorch the board, don't break any traces. You want to kind of take your time with this part and do it as neatly as you possibly can. Once you've fully hollowed out the hole that used to contain the leg of the component, you can take that little piece of wire that we prepped earlier, put one end of it inside of the board, and solder it just like it was a component. Just like when soldering anything else, we're looking for nice round and shiny joints, and you can give it a little tug just to make sure it's durable and it's going to stand up to when we connect it to the switch. Now we're going to need another length of wire connected to the other end of the cut, and that would be at the opened end of the component. A similar length of wire is probably best, as they are both going to be going to the same side of the switch, and therefore the ends of them should be equidistant to each other. Now, the way that I like to do this is I'd like to take one end of the wire and wrap it around the open end of the component, in this case, the leg of the capacitor that is sticking up out of the board, and then putting a little bead of solder on there just to get it nice and strong, and then wrapping it in something like electrical tape. This is kind of a quick and dirty way to do it, but as long as you're very careful when you put the board back inside the enclosure, this should stand up for quite a bit of time. Are there better ways to do it? Almost absolutely, but this is the way we're going to approach this particular mod. Now, using pretty much the exact same process, we're going to be doing the same thing to the resistor on the other end of the board, the one that is by the output jack. We're going to first try to hollow out the space where the remaining leg is still connected to, that is not connected to the resistor, and then we are going to thread the wire through it just like we did before. Again, patience is kind of a virtue here, so definitely be careful while you do it, but once you get it completely hollowed out, it should be fairly easy to just thread that piece of wire through and then to solder it from the other side like so. And once again, we are going to connect yet another wire to the other end of our cut, which should be the remaining piece of leg coming off of the resistor that is still connected to the board. So you might be asking, like, what is the point of all this and why exactly we're going through the trouble of adding all of these wires? And the general idea is that we are trying to re-bridge the connection that we had cut when we originally started doing this mod. We want everything to go back to its factory settings when we flip this toggle switch. To get the gist of how this works, you kind of need to understand the relationship of two lugs on a toggle switch depending on which direction it is flicked in. In the case of a double pull, double throw like this one, you actually have two switches that are being activated at the same time. By flipping the switch upwards, you are connecting the middle and bottom on the left side and the middle and the bottom on the right side, but they are not connected to each other. An easy way to keep this organized is to solder all the left wires on the left side of the switch and the right wires on the right side of the switch. And technically speaking, which wire goes into which lug in this case actually is interchangeable. Just be sure to thread them through neatly so that you're not getting a little strand of wire touching a lug that it shouldn't be. Once you have it set up like so, you can actually go ahead and start threading the other side of the wires as well. Just make sure that you are using the same rows as you did on the previous side. Once again, which wire goes in the middle lug is actually inconsequential and you can put either one in either position. Now this particular switch that I was using was actually reclaimed from another project, so I actually had to solder the frayed end of my wire to get it to thread through a little bit, and then use a screwdriver to kind of bend the extra frayed edges out of the way of the other lugs. Do whatever you have to do to keep it nice, neat, and organized. Once you have that switch prepped, you can go ahead and start soldering the wires to the lugs. And again, we're looking for nice, round, and shiny joints. Next, you're going to want to use your wire cutters to cut off any excess strands that might be causing some congestion around the lugs on the switch. Once that's all said and done, it is time to start thinking about where we want to put the switch on our enclosure. Now, I have this one place by the battery compartment that has a lot of space and makes it really easy to fit on, and I actually just drill right through the sticker and I can kind of use it as a guide for where I want to put my hole. Specifically right here on the letter E is where I like to drill, but you know, to each their own. My drill press probably would have been a better option for this, but I did want to show how easy and possible it was to just use a hand drill to get the exact same results. Again, patience is just kind of the name of the game here. Once you've made it all the way through, you can actually just peel that sticker right off, as it just looks kind of silly with a big hole going through it now. But as you can see, the hole came out nice, straight, and even. We did chip a little bit of the paint around the edge, but that's okay. We're just going to cover that with some of the hardware from the switch that we're putting in. And speaking of that hardware, switches do come with quite a bit of it usually, and I feel like everybody kind of uses a different amount of that hardware to complete their projects. So I'm just going to show you how I do it. The first thing I do is I screw on one of the tiny little nuts over the edge, and then I take the big flat washer with the little tooth on it, and that is what goes against the internal wall of my enclosure. And before we put anything else on, we just want to kind of make sure this fits the right way, and we want to find the best way to keep it organized. I'm actually going to turn the switch so that I have a little bit more room for the foot switch when we put the board back in. Then I'm going to take the little internal tooth washer and the last nut and assemble the rest of the switch together. The 8mm socket rocket seems to be the one that fits pretty much every toggle switch, at least all the ones that I use. Once the switch is in there all nice and tight, it is time to place the board back into the enclosure. Now, when doing so, you obviously have to be mindful of all the extra wires you added. You don't want them to get crimped or crushed, and everything should line up exactly with the holes that they were originally lined up with before we started taking this thing apart. One downside for the placement of my switch is that you can obviously no longer fit a 9-volt battery inside, so you're going to need an external power supply. Once everything looks lined up, it is time to put all of the hardware back into the pedal in the opposite order from how you took it off. Don't forget about the little internal washer that goes in the knob before you place it on the potentiometer, but also don't forget to turn the potentiometer all the way to the left before you put your knob on and zero it out. Otherwise, your parameters are not going to be where you think they are when you're turning the knob. Once everything is in place, this is usually where I go through and I do the final turn of all the hardware just to make sure everything is nice and tight at the end before we go and put the back on the enclosure. And this includes the switch. You don't want that thing spinning around and then no longer be able to tell when you're actually engaging the mod. And the real last step of this is just putting all the screws back in and sealing up your enclosure. And there you have it. You have successfully completed the script mod for the Phase 90 with a toggle switch to go back to its original factory settings. Let's plug this thing up and see how it sounds.